The Science of Hypnotism, edited and compiled by L. E. Young in 1899. Read by Felix Warren. Chapter 2. Hypnotism as discovered by Dr. J. Braid, his method, and a few interesting cases as cited by him in his noted book, Neuropnology. This science had lived under many names, none quite what the world demanded, for science so profound and mysterious, yet so simple and easily applied. It had received many names before Dr. Braid undertook the task of rechristening it, but each was objectionable, because they all implied something more or less than the science gave. But when Dr. Braid denominated it hypnotism, from the Greek word signifying sleep, it was hailed as a compromise sufficiently non-committal to entitle it to recognition, and hypnotism it will be called until some academician drags to light the ultimate cause of all things. Dr. Braid is entitled to great credit for the discovery that the hypnotic state can be induced independently of the presence or cooperation of another person. Two facts seem to have been demonstrated by his experiments, both of which are of the utmost importance. First, that the hypnotic sleep can be induced independently of personal contact with, or the personal influence of, another. Second, that the sleep can be induced by his method without the aid of any suggestion. The mistake which his followers have made is in jumping to the conclusion that because one of the primary conditions of hypnotic phenomena can be induced without the aid of the magnetic hypothesis, therefore the magnetic hypothesis is therefore incorrect. The same logic would induce a man who for the first time sees a railroad train in motion to conclude that any other method of locomotion is impracticable. Braid himself was not so illogical, for he expressly says that he does not consider the methods identical, but does consider the condition of the nervous system induced by both modes to be analogous. The scientific development of hypnotism we will now begin to give. In this we see, to a certain extent, a combination of the two processes just mentioned. That is to say, it is found that special manipulation can call forth a changed mental condition, hypnosis. It can, however, also be shown that when a man calls this out, it is not by virtue of any peculiar and mysterious unknown power, as until Braid's time was supposed. At first, Dr. Braid considered hypnotism to be identical with the mesmeric states, but he soon gave up this view. He was of opinion that the two conditions were only analogous, and he left mesmerism in an independent position by the side of hypnotism. Braid was acquainted with the cataleptic phenomena, as we will show, and certain suggestions, and used hypnotism therapeutically. In particular, he used it to perform painless surgical operations. Already earlier, mesmerism had been several times made use of in surgical operations. To Dr. Braid is due the discovery of hypnotism, and the words Braidism and Braidic suggestion have remained in science to commemorate a new doctrine which arose in the very face of mesmerism. Dr. Braid proved that no magnetic fluid exists, and that no mysterious force emanates from the hypnotizer. The hypnotic state and its associated phenomena are purely subjective in their origin, which is in the nervous system of the subject himself. The fixation of a brilliant object so that the muscle which holds up the upper eyelid becomes fatigued, and the concentration of the attention on a single idea brings about the sleep. The subjects can even bring about this condition themselves by their own tension of mind, without being submitted to any influence from without. In this state, the imagination becomes so lively that every idea spontaneously developed or suggested by a person to whom the subject gives this peculiar attention and confidence has the value of an actual representation for him. The oftener these phenomena are induced, the more readily and easily can they be induced, for such is the law of association and habit. If the hypnotizer's will is not expressed by his words or his gestures, or if the subject does not understand them, no phenomena appears. The attitude which is given the hypnotized subject, the position into which the muscles of his limbs or face are put, may give rise to sentiment, passions, and acts corresponding to these anatomical attitudes, in the same manner that the suggestion of certain sentiments or passions may give rise to correlative mimicked attitude or expression. This part of Braid's work cannot be attacked. Observation confirms it on all points, but Braid's experiments did not make such stir till years after the discovery of hypnotism. Dr. Braid also showed, besides that these phenomena could be induced in certain subjects in the waking condition by simple vocal suggestion, which fact he published in a memoir entitled The Power of the Mind over the Body. emotion, sensation, the passions, and even the exercise of the organic functions could be modified by a foreign will without the induction of hypnotism. Braid had proved that the concentration of the attention and thought obtained by fixation of the gaze were the determining causes of the hypnotic state, but he did not try to fathom the physiological and psychological mechanism of the phenomena. Durand de Grosse tried to go further and to explain the relations which exist between the concentration of thought, the first point of departure of the Braidic modification, and the appearance of insensibility, catalepsy, and ecstasy, that is, in a word, the profound and general revolution of the economy, which is its culminating point. The following is the author's theory, as he himself gives it. A general and sufficiently intense activity of thought is necessary for the regular diffusion of nervous force in the nerves of sensibility. If this activity ceases, the innervation of these nerves is suppressed, and they lose their ability to conduct external impressions to the brain. In fact, we know that idiots are more or less anesthetic, etc. On the other hand, sensation is the necessary stimulus to mental activity. From this it follows that in order to bring about insensibility, it suffices to suspend the exercise of thought, and in order to suspend this, it is necessary to isolate the senses from the external agents which act upon them. It is not possible to suspend the actions of the mind, but they may be reduced to a minimum by submitting them exclusively to a simple, homogeneous, and continuous sensation. Thus its sphere of action is reduced to a simple point. The cerebral ganglion cell continues to secrete its nervous force, but that only consumes a very small part of the whole amount. Hence, its nervous force accumulates in the brain until congestion takes place. This is the first part of the Braidic operation, which produces what the author calls the hypotaxic condition. This condition being once produced, the impression glides in as far as the brain, through the half-open door of the sensorium, along the path of sight, of hearing, or of muscular sense, and the point to which this excitation is transferred immediately emerges from its torpor, to become the seat of an activity which the tension of the nervous force increases with all its power. Thus it is that general arrest of innervation will all at once succeed an excessive local innervation, which, for example, will instantaneously substitute hyperesthesia for insensibility, and catalepsy, tetanus, etc., for relaxation of the muscular system, etc. The available nervous force may be called to this or that functional point of the center of innervation by directing toward this point an impression which arouses its peculiar activity. To accomplish this, a mental impression is employed, that is to say, an idea is suggested. This constitutes the second stage of the Braidic operation, which Durand de Grosse calls idioplastic. The idea becomes a determining case of the functional modifications to be induced. The mental excitation reproduces the sensation previously induced by means of organic excitations. These sensations, which are originated by means of an idea, are called sensations of recollection. It is quite natural for any man to prefer the evidence of his own senses to that of all others. No one who has the opportunity to examine the phenomena for himself should neglect to do so. However, there are some circumstances which ought to be particularly borne in mind, or very erroneous opinion may be formed by the uninitiated from what is actually witnessed. First, there is a remarkable difference in the degree of susceptibility of different individuals to the hypnotic influence, some becoming rapidly and intensely affected, others slowly and feebly so. This is one analogous to what we experience in regard to the effects of medicine on different individuals, and especially as regards wine and opium and nitrous oxide. Whilst this is a recognized fact, as regards the latter, it appears to me somewhat surprising to find many and even professional men, too, who seem to expect as much uniformity ought to obtain in regard to the phenomena during hypnotism as if we were operating on inanimate matter. On the contrary, they ought to be ready to admit that such a variety might be expected to arise even in the same individual, according to the physical and mental condition of the patient at the moment the operation is performed. The next most important point for consideration is the fact that of all the phenomena being consecutive, we have thus the extremes of insensibility and exalted sensibility, of rigidity and mobility, at different stages, and these merging into each other by the most imperceptible gradations, or in the most abrupt manner, according to the mode of treating the patient. It is no unusual thing for different parties to be testing or calling for tests for the opposite conditions at the same instance of time. These, of course, are incompatible, but at a certain stage The transitions from torpor of all the senses and cataleptiform rigidity to the most exalted sensibility and flaccidity of muscle may be effected almost with the celerity of thought, even so slight a cause as a breath of air directed against the part. If left at rest, it will speedily merge back again, and thus those unacquainted with such peculiarities will be continually liable to think they could discover discrepancies which, however, only originate from their imperfect knowledge of the subject, such as an unskilful manipulator will be ready to suppose from his different results that the observations of other chemists have been erroneous. The third point meriting special attention is the condition of the mind at different stages. As results from opium, so also from hypnotism. At one stage it gives an extraordinary power of concentration of thought, or disposition to rapt contemplation, whereas at another stage the discursive or imaginative faculties are excited into full play, and thus the most expanded, bright, and glowing scenes and images are presented to the fervid imagination. It must also be borne in mind that these opposite mental conditions may glide into each other by the most imperceptible degrees, or by the most abrupt transitions, according to the modes of management, and thus consciousness or unconsciousness, sound sleep, or somnambulism will result, according as sensations or ideas predominate. It appears quite evident that whatever images or mental emotions or thoughts have been excited in the mind during the nervous sleep are generally liable to recur or be renovated or manifested when the patient is again placed under similar circumstances. I am induced to adopt this course from my anxiety to remove every possible source of error as to the cause of the original manifestations, and from the recollection of the remarkable circumstance of the woman who during natural somnambulism could repeat correctly portions of the Hebrew Bible and other books in languages she had never studied, and was perfectly ignorant of when awake, but was at length discovered to have been acquired from hearing a clergyman with whom she had resided when a girl reading them aloud to himself, and also from patients whilst laboring under diseases remembering languages long forgotten. Then during the nervous sleep there is the power of exciting patients to manifest the passions and emotions, and certain mental faculties in a more striking manner than the same individuals are capable of in the waking condition. No one can doubt who has seen much of these experiments, and it can in no way alter the importance of hypnotism as a curative power, and extraordinary means of controlling and directing mental functions in a particular manner by a simple association of impressions, whether we thus act on the brain as a single organ or a combination of separate organs, or whether the primary associations have originated from the special organic connections or from some accidental and unknown cause, or from preconcerted arrangement and arbitrary association. The experiments that I have made, says Dr. Braid, of having caused patients to hypnotize, manipulate, and rouse themselves by simply desiring them to rub their own eyes, and which produce results precisely the same as when done by anyone else, can seem to me to be the most decisive proof possible that the whole result from the mind and body of the patients acting and reacting on each other, and that it has no dependence on any special influence emanating from another. My first experiments on this point were instituted in the presence of some friends on the 1st day of May, 1843, and following days. I believe they were the first experiments of the kind which had ever been tried, and they have succeeded in every case in which I have operated. Observation, having thus shown what the simple hypnotic suggestion can perform in the healthy condition, it was natural to apply these qualities to pathological states, and to make use of the nervous activity concentrated by means of suggestion, in neutralizing morbid phenomena. It was natural to say to oneself, if, in a hypnotized subject, anesthesia, constructure, movements, pains can be produced at will by an analogous mechanism, it ought to be possible in some cases to suppress anesthesia, contracture, or paralysis caused by disease, to increase the weakened muscular force, to modify favorably, or to restore the functional force perverted or diminished by the pathological condition, as far, of course, as the organic condition permits this restoration. It would seem that an idea so simple as this would have forced itself upon the attention of the first physicians who learned to recognize suggestion. But it has been a long time coming to the front. As long as magnetic phenomena were considered the effect of a fluid acting upon the organism, it was to this fluid action that the cures were attributed. Magnetism, by its mysterious influence upon the vital principle, re-established functional harmony. It was beneficial like warmth, light, and electricity. Since Braid's time, the hypothesis of a magnetic fluid has had few adherents, Hypnotic suggestion has replaced magnetism. It is the subject's imagination alone which rendered active and causes all the phenomena. It is a singular thing that Braid, who was first to establish the doctrine of suggestion, caught sight of, for a moment by Bertrand, upon firm foundation, thought no more of applying suggestion itself in its most natural form, suggestion by speech, to bring about the hypnosis and the therapeutic effects. He induced sleep by fixation upon a brilliant object. He brought about therapeutic effects by means of special manipulation. The manipulations are based upon this fact, that the cataleptiform rigidity of a limb produces, according to Braid, an acceleration of the pulse, which becomes small. This acceleration of the pulse caused by the effort to hold the limbs stretched out for 5 minutes is much greater in the hypnotic than in the normal condition. If the muscles are made to relax while the subject is still under the influence of the hypnosis, the pulse declines rapidly to its rate before the experiment, and even below it. This understood, Braid varies the manipulation according to the object in view. In order to diminish, Braid says, the force of the circulation in a limb and reduce its sensibility, it is necessary to set the muscles of this limb in activity, leaving the other limbs relaxed. If we wish to increase the force and the sensibility of a limb, it must be kept relaxed and the other limbs must be put into catalepsy. If we wish to obtain a general depression, and after one or two of the limbs have been extended for a short time, we must put them back carefully into the normal position and let the entire body rest. To obtain a general excitation, all the limbs should be rendered cataleptic, whence arises difficulty in the free transmission of blood to them, and consequently an augmentation of the cardiac activity, rush of blood to the brain, and excitation of the nervous centers. Further, in keeping of a particular organ in action while the others are quiet, there is a considerable augmentation of its activity by concentration of its nervous energy in keeping the other organs in activity, and the one which is too active quiet, its activity is diminished. The following we give in Dr. Braid's own words, as found in his noted book, Neuropnology. We feel the readers will better understand his method if given to them as he gave it to the public. It will be observed that I have now entirely separated hypnotism from animal magnetism. I consider it to be merely a simple, speedy, and certain mode of throwing the nervous system into a new condition, which may be rendered eminently available in the cure of certain disorders. I feel quite confident we have acquired in this process a valuable addition to our curative means, but I repudiate the idea of holding it up as a universal remedy, nor do I understand, as yet, the whole range of diseases in which it may be useful. I am aware great prejudice has been raised against mesmerism from the idea that it might be turned to immoral purposes. In respect to the neurohypnotic state induced by my methods, James Braid, MRCSE, CMWS, I am quite certain that it deserves no such censure. I have proved by experiments, both in public and in private, that during the state of excitement the judgment is sufficiently active to make the patients, if possible, even more fastidious as regards propriety of conduct than in the waking condition, and from the state of rigidity and insensibility they can be roused to a state of mobility and exalted sensibility either by being rudely handled or even by a breath of air. Nor is it requisite that this should be done by the person who put them in the hypnotic state. It will follow equally from the manipulation of anyone else, or a current of air infringing against the body from any mechanical contrivance whatsoever. And finally, the state cannot be induced in any stage, unless with the knowledge and consent of the party operated on. This is more than can be said respecting a great number of our most valuable medicines, for there are many of which we are in the daily habit of using with the best advantage in the relief and cure of disease, which may be and have been rendered most potent for the furtherance of the ends of the vicious and cruel, and which can be administered without the knowledge of the intended victim. It ought never be in lost sight of that there is the use and abuse of everything in nature. It is the use and only the judicious use of hypnotism which I advocate. Definition of forms. Neuropnology is derived from the Greek word for nerve sleep, a discourse, and means the nationale or doctrine of nervous sleep, which I define to be a peculiar condition of the nervous system, induced by a fixed and abstracted attention of the mental and visual eye on one object, not of an exciting nature. By the term neurohypnotism, this is to be understood nervous sleep, and for the sake of brevity, suppressing the prefix neuro by the terms as follows. Hypnotic, the state or condition of nervous sleep. Hypnotize, to induce nervous sleep. Hypnotized, one who has been put into the state of nervous sleep. Hypnotism, nervous sleep. Dehypnotize, to restore from the state or condition of nervous sleep. Dehypnotized, restored from the state or condition of nervous sleep. Hypnotist, one who practices neurohypnotism. I now proceed to detail the mode which I practice for inducing the phenomena. Take any bright object, I generally use my lancet case, between the thumb and fore and middle fingers of the left hand. Hold it from 8 to 15 inches from the eyes, at such position above the forehead as may be necessary to produce the greatest possible strain upon the eyes and eyelids, and enable the patient to maintain a steady fixed stare at the object. The patient must be made to understand that he is to keep the eyes steadily fixed on the object, and the mind riveted on the idea of that one object. It will be observed that owing to the consensual adjustment of the eyes, the pupils will be at first contracted, they will shortly begin to dilate, and after they have done so to a considerable extent, and have assumed a wavy motion, if the fore and middle fingers of the right hand extended and a little separated, are carried from the object toward the eyes, most probably the eyelids will close involuntarily, with a vibratory motion. If this is not the case, or the patient allows the eyeballs to move, desire him to begin anew, giving him to understand that he is to allow the eyelids to close when the fingers are again carried toward the eyes, but the eyeballs must be kept fixed in the same position, and the mind riveted to the one idea of the object held above the eyes. It will generally be found that the eyelids close with a vibratory motion, or become spasmodically closed. After 10 or 15 seconds have elapsed, by gently elevating the arms and legs, it will be found that the patient has a disposition to retain them in the situation they have been placed, if he is intensely affected. If this is not the case, in a soft tone of voice, desire him to retain the limbs in the extended position, and thus the pulse will speedily become greatly accelerated, and the limbs in progress of time will become quite rigid and involuntarily fixed. It will also be found that all the organs of special sense, excepting sight, including heat and cold, and muscular motion and resistance, and certain mental faculties are at first prodigiously exalted, such as happens with regard to the primary effects of opium or spirits. After a certain point, however, this exaltation of functions is followed by a state of depression far greater than the torpor of natural sleep. By mere repose, the senses will speedily merge into the original condition again. From the state of the most profound torpor of the organs of special sense and tonic rigidity of the muscles, they may at this stage instantly be restored to the opposite condition of extreme mobility and exalted sensibility, by directing a current of air against the organ or organs we wish to excite to action, or the muscles we wish to render limber, and which had been in the cataleptiform state. An abrupt blow or pressure over the rigid muscle will dehypnotize a rigid part, but I have found that pressing the nose will not restore smell, unless very gentle and continued, nor will pressing a handkerchief against the ear restore hearing when the ear has become torpid, nor will gentle friction over the skin restore sensibility to the dormant skin or mobility to the rigid muscles underneath, unless so gentle as to be titillation properly so called. And yet, a slight puff of wind will instantly rouse the whole to abnormal sensibility and mobility, a fact which has perplexed and puzzled me exceedingly. At first I required the patients to look at an object until the eyelids closed of themselves involuntarily. I found, however, in many cases this was followed by pain in the globes of the eyes and slight inflammation of the conjunctival membrane. In order to avoid this, I now close the eyelids when the impression on the pupil already inferred has taken place, because I find that the beneficial phenomena follow this method, provided that the eyeballs are kept fixed, and thus, too, the unpleasant feelings in the globes of the eyes will be prevented. Were the object to produce astonishment in the person operated on by finding himself unable to open his eyes, the former method is the better, as the eyes once closed, it is generally impossible for him to open them, whereas they may be opened for a considerable time after being closed in the other mode I now recommend. However, for curative purposes, I prefer the plan which leaves no pain in the globes of the eyes. I feel confident that the phenomena are induced solely by an impression made on the nervous centers by the physical, psychical condition of the patient, irrespective of any agency providing from or excited into action by another, as any one can hypnotize himself by attending strictly to the simple rules I lay down, and the following is a striking example of the fact which was communicated to me and two other gentlemen by a most respectable teacher. He had found that a number of his pupils had been in the habit of hypnotizing themselves, and he had ordered them to discontinue the practice. However, one day he ascertained a girl had hypnotized herself by looking at the wall, and that a companion had put a pen in her hand, which she had written the word Manchester, and she held the pen very firmly. In fact, the fingers were cataleptiformally rigid. He spoke to her in a very gentle tone of voice, and called her. She arose and advanced towards him, and when awake was not aware he had called her or of what had passed. A patient may be hypnotized by keeping the eyes fixed in any direction. It occurs more slowly and feebly when the eyes are directed straight forward, and most rapidly and intensely when they can be maintained in the position of a double internal and upward squint. It is important to remark that the oftener the patients are hypnotized from association of ideas and habit, the more susceptible they become, and in this way they are liable to be affected entirely through the imagination. Thus, if they consider or imagine there is something doing, although they do not see it, from which they are to be affected, they will become affected, but on the contrary, the most expert hypnotist in the world may exert all his endeavors in vain if the party does not expect it, and mentally and bodily comply, and thus yield to it. It is on this very principle of overexerting the attention by keeping it riveted on one subject or idea which is not of itself an exciting nature, and overexercising one set of muscles, and the state of the strained eyes, with the suppressed respiration, and the general repose which attends such experiments, which excites in the brain and whole nervous system that peculiar state which I call hypnotism or nervous sleep. The most striking proofs that it is different from common sleep are the extraordinary effects produced by it. In deep abstraction of mind, it is well known the individual becomes unconscious of surrounding objects, and in some cases of severe bodily inflictions. During hypnotism or nervous sleep, the functions in action seem so intensely active as must be, in a great measure, rob the others of that degree of nervous energy necessary for exciting their sensibility. This alone may account for much of the dullness of common feeling during the abnormal quickness and extended range of action or certain other functions. I shall now point out the symptoms of danger, with the mode of arousing patients, and thus preventing mischief which might ensue for want of due caution in the operator. Whenever I observe breathing very much oppressed, the face greatly flushed, the rigidity excessive, or the action of the heart very quick and tumultuous, I instantly arouse the patient, which I have always readily and speedily succeeded in doing by a clap of the hands, an abrupt shock on the arm or leg, by striking them sharply with the flat hand, pressure and friction over the eyelids, and by a current of air wafted against the face. I have never failed by these means to restore my patients very speedily. I feel convinced that hypnotism is not only a valuable, but also a perfectly safe remedy for many complaints, if judiciously used. Still, it ought not to be trifled with by ignorant persons for the mere sake of gratifying idle curiosity. In all cases of apoplectic tendency, or where there is aneurism or serious organic disease of the heart, it ought not to be resorted to, excepting with the precaution that it may be in the mode calculated to depress the force and frequency of the heart's action. In passing into common or natural sleep, objects are perceived more and more faintly, the eyelids close and remain quiescent, and all the other sections and organs of special sense must become gradually blunted, and cease to convey their usual impressions to the brain. The limbs become flaccid from cessation of muscular tone and action. The pulse and respiration become slower. The pupils are turned upwards and inwards, and are contracted. Muller. In the hypnotic state induced with the view of exhibiting what I call the hypnotic phenomena, vision becomes more and more imperfect. The eyelids are closed, but have for a considerable time a vibratory motion. In some few they are forcibly closed, as by spasm of the orbicularis. The organs of special sense, particularly of smell, touch, and hearing, heat and cold, and resistance, are greatly exalted and afterwards become blunted in a degree far beyond natural sleep. The pupils are turned upwards and inwards, but contrary to what happens in natural sleep. They are greatly dilated and highly insensible to light. After a length of time, the pupils become contracted, whilst the eyes are still insensible to light. The pulse and respiration are at first slower than is natural, but immediately on calling muscles into action, a tendency to cataleptiform rigidity is assumed, with rapid pulse and oppressed and quick breathing. The limbs are thus maintained in a state of tonic rigidity for any length of time I have yet thought it prudent to try, instead of that state of flaccidity induced by common or natural sleep, and the most remarkable circumstance is this, that there seems to be no corresponding state of muscular exhaustion from such action. In passing into natural sleep, anything held in the hand is soon allowed to drop from our grasp, but in the artificial sleep now referred to, it will be held much more firmly than before falling asleep. This is a very remarkable difference. The power of balancing themselves is so great that I have never seen one of these hypnotic somnambulists fall. The same is noted of natural somnambulists. This is a remarkable fact, and would appear to occur in this way, that they acquire the center of gravity as if by instinct in the most natural and therefore in the most graceful manner, and if allowed to remain in this position they will speedily become cataleptiform and immovably fixed. From observing these two facts, and the general tendency and taste for dancing displayed by most patients on hearing lively music during hypnotism, the peculiarly graceful and appropriate movement of many when thus excited, and the varied and elegant postures they may be made to assume by slight currents of air, and the faculty of retaining any position with so much ease, I have hazarded the opinion that the Greeks may have been indebted to hypnotism for the perfection of their sculpture, and the fakirs of India for their wonderful feats of suspending their bodies by a leg or an arm. It thus clearly appears that it differs from common sleep in many respects, that there is first a state of excitement as with opium and wine and spirits, and afterwards a state of corresponding deep depression or torpor. Effect of hypnotism. The tactual sensibility is so great that the slightest touch is felt. The sense of heat, cold, and resistance are also exalted to that degree as to enable the patient to feel anything without actual contact. In some cases, at a considerable distance, some will feel a breath of air from the lips at the distance of 50 to 90 feet and bend from it, and by making a back current, as by waving the hand, or a fan, will move in the opposite direction. The patient has a tendency to approach to or recede from impressions according as they are agreeable or disagreeable, either in quality or intensity. Thus they will approach to soft sounds, but they will recede from loud sounds, however harmonious. By allowing a little time to elapse, and the patient to be in a state of quietude, he will lapse into the opposite extreme of rigidity and torpor of all the senses, so that he will not hear the loudest noise, nor smell the most fragrant or pungent odor, nor feel what is hot or cold, although not only approximated to, but brought into contact with the skin. He may now be pricked or pinched or maimed without exciting the slightest symptom of pain or sensibility, and the limbs will remain rigidly fixed. At this stage, a puff of wind directed against any organ instantaneously rouses it to sensibility, and the rigid muscles to a state of mobility. Thus the patient may be unconscious of the loudest noise, but by simply causing a current of air to come against the ear, a moderate noise will instantly be heard so intensely as to make the patient start and shiver violently, although the whole body had immediately before been rigidly cataleptiform. A rose, valerian, or strong ammonia may have been held close under the nostrils without being perceived, but a puff of wind directed against the nostrils will instantly arouse the sense so much that, supposing the rose had been carried 46 feet distant, the patient has instantly set off in pursuit of it, and even whilst the eyes were bandaged, reached it as certainly as a dog traces out game, but as respects valerian or ammonia, will rush from the unpleasant smell with great haste. The same with the sense of touch. Curative powers of hypnotism. Of all the circumstances connected with hypnotic sleep, nothing so strongly marks the difference between it and natural sleep as the wonderful power the former evinces in curing many diseases of long standing, and which had resisted natural sleep and every known agency for years. Patients who had been born deaf and dumb of various ages up to 32 years of age had been continued without the power of hearing sound until the time they were operated on by me, and yet they were enabled to do so by being kept in the hypnotic state for 8, 10, or 12 months, and have had their hearing still further improved by a repetition of similar operations. Now, supposing these patients to have spent 6 hours out of 24 in sleep, many of them have had 5, 6, or 8 years of continuous sleep, but still awoke as they lay down, incapable of hearing sound, and yet they have had some degrees of it communicated to them by a few minutes of hypnotism. Can any stronger proof be wanted or adduced that it is very different from common sleep? A lady 54 years of age had been suffering for 16 years from incipient amaurosis. When she called on me, she could with difficulty read 2 words of the largest heading of a newspaper. After 8 minutes of hypnotic sleep, however, she could read the other words and in 3 minutes more the whole of the smaller heading, and the same afternoon, with the aid of her glasses, she read the 118th Psalm, 29 verses, in the small diamond polyglot Bible, which for years had been a sealed book to her. There has also been a most remarkable improvement in this lady's general health since she was hypnotized. Is there any individual who can fail to see in this case something different than common sleep? Whilst I feel assured from personal experience and the testimony of professional friends on whose judgment and candor I can implicitly rely, that in this we have acquired an important curative agency for a certain class of diseases, I desire it to be distinctly understood that I by no means wish to hold it up as a universal remedy. I believe it is capable of doing great good if judiciously applied. Diseases evince totally different pathological conditions, and the treatment ought to be varied accordingly. We have, therefore, no right to expect to find a universal remedy either in this or any other method of treatment. From the foregoing you can readily see that D. Braid proved hypnotism to contain great virtue, mainly to be used as a curative power. Since his discovery, the medical world has from time to time made researches which always prove the same, but a science so simple yet so hard to explain to the ordinary mind gains firm ground slowly. Thus, year after year has passed by, without hypnotism becoming popular among doctors and patients. In fact, not until the year 1860 did any physician dream of applying hypnotism for diseases the same as he applied medicine. Then Dr. Leibold took up the study where Dr. Braid had left off. So great has been his achievements that today all the scientific world wonders. To him too much credit cannot be given, as it is through his patient efforts that the medical world at last acknowledges the power of this great science, hypnotism, as you will see further on. End of chapter 2.